We're getting back into it. Back into it. What have we got today? Today. But what is any day? Yas. When we step back from our default coding, what's underlying this stepping back, taking a step back, is becoming aware of what we are taking a step back from. And also, that's not to say that default coding is wrong and bad. I'm not saying that this is what, I'm not saying that this author is saying that. I'm more saying that to myself. Yeah, this is something I was thinking about earlier this morning, actually. Excessive hope to excessive despair. It's not specifically these frameworks that I was thinking about. I was thinking about extremes and how with polarities there are extremes on either end, if you will, and how those extremes, in whatever context is being expressed, those extremes sort of by default, to use that word that's being used here, by default, inherently perhaps, they form a structure. They sort of represent the bounds, the boundaries, the sort of endpoints if thought of linearly. They form the infrastructure of that concept. So it may not be obvious. Perhaps there are many words that could be used to describe a particular middle ground. So for example here, hope and despair, what would be considered, what would feel correct as the sort of middle point of both in the middle of excessive hope and excessive despair? I mean, honestly, what seems to come through oftentimes is just peace. Is okayness. Is perhaps here surrender. So perhaps where there are experiences of excessive hope, when there is that excessive hope in the experience of whatever is appearing to happen, like I'm not really quite sure how that correlates, how that, like I'm not really sure what that means to say that it's the infrastructure. What is it the infrastructure of? How does it apply in our normal life? What can we, how can we build from that? It's just something that was coming through this morning and I found that quite interesting. I hadn't really thought of it quite like that before, so this is just reminding me of that. Yeah, unknowing seems to be sort of synonymous with the beginner's mind. Openness. I love this. The student's initial instinct to regurgitate what they were familiar with, rather than risk a foray into unfamiliar propositions, says much more about the type of intelligence our culture prioritizes than the actual intelligence of our students. Wow. What I've come to realize is that if ChatGPT is dangerous, as many media sources have described and decried, one of its primary threats is to reveal, as Blum puts it, that the original thought we hold dear is actually a, quote, complex remix of everything we've taken in from parents, peers, and teachers, end quote. What was I talking about with tributaries? Yeah, it kind of would have been funny if ChatGPT's answer was, think outside the box, go with the absurd. Go with what seems absurd. Play around. You're safe to do so. I find this kind of ironic in a way. There is a tendency to push for more resiliency just as much as there is a push for more efficiency. More efficiency, I suppose, being a bit more technical, whereas resiliency, yeah, it could be technical, but it could also be more adaptive. But more resiliency, in a way, one could say that the cultural priority of a certain definition and appearance of intelligence, one could say that that priority of intelligence is extremely resilient. Resilient, in a way, sort of feels like it is speaking to the strength of one's sort of prolonged existence. And so it's kind of ironic here because, in a way, for it to be adaptive, perhaps it would require sort of less resiliency, or there would be a call for less resiliency and perhaps something else. Just simply more adaptability. Maybe here I imagine adaptability, perhaps she is synonymizing adaptability with resiliency to sort of equate them, to say they're speaking of the same thing. To be resilient is to be adaptive. I wouldn't want to lose sight that resiliency can also perpetuate the prioritization of that which appears to have longevity. And longevity can oftentimes be supported through consistency and rigidity. So what are we really talking about here in terms of resiliency, and why is that even prioritized? Is there a fear of loss? Is there a fear of death? Is there a fear of life? Is there a hold on one's sort of the egoic sense of what it is to have a human experience and to be experiencing human life? Is there still You know, what portion of this perception is rooted in a fear, an egoic sense of fear around the loss of one's sense of themselves. And that there is this, and within that there is this desire, this need to fix what feels to the egoic sense of self lost or broken or at risk. And so there is this need to grip onto that which creates this resiliency, that which will keep us living, almost rather than just learning the intelligence of peace within oneself, no matter what appears to be happening in one's experience. And I know that that's easier said than done. But the intelligence of grounding in a higher, if I can use that word, although it doesn't, I don't mean it in a hierarchical sense, but just learning to ground in a resiliency that is inherent, that doesn't need to become more resilient. It already is. That resiliency already exists. That resiliency is already within oneself to be experienced, and within that be regenerative. It's not necessarily an experience that needs to be cultivated outside of oneself, but sort of learning the intelligence of resiliency that already exists within the experience of human living, of worldly living. I'm sitting here editing this video, and what's coming through at the moment is tied to what I was talking about a little bit before with the extremes, and how the extremes were coming through at the time as having something to do with formulation and shaping and infrastructure in connection with concepts, very abstract, and something about their extreme presentations or their extreme the lived experiences of that concept's extremes, how those lived experiences form some sense of infrastructure around how we relate to them, or that they give some kind of shape to the relationship, some kind of tangibility to the relationship for there to be conscious, more holistic centering in the heart of the matter sort of being the concept, if you will. And I get that this is kind of like, so do we look at everything as a concept? Not necessarily, but it's one perception, it's one interpretation. And so what is coming through in listening to this particular video is using the concept of resiliency as an example. The extremes that tend to come through first in the conscious awareness is most resilient and least resilient. So most and least forming the extremes, the sort of boundaries of the experience of resiliency. What started to come through at that point was, well, maybe that's not the only extreme. Like, maybe that's not the only experience of extremes. There is what I'm talking about here, sort of this inner experience of resiliency. And then there is sort of this outer experience of resiliency that that there's a tendency to look for, there is a tendency to seek outside of oneself. And then there is the resiliency cultivated within oneself. So these sort of extremes, the inner and the outer, also forming in a multi-dimensional sense this least and most and inner and outer. And so how it's not necessarily so much about centering in the middle, in the middle ground, because it's the middle, and the middle perhaps has this connotation of being neutral, and perhaps there is a frequency of truth to that. What I'm more referring to in centering is a sense of alignment with that inner reality and the outer reality, no matter how the outer reality sort of presents itself, and no matter how the inner reality presents itself, even if the inner reality is presenting itself through an experience of fragility, there is still that accessibility to the experience of resiliency, because it's inherent, and as it's inherent, as it's innate, as it's fundamental, it's inalienable. And so that inalienable aspect of the essence of being, centering in that and aligning with that in the world, grounds within a pillar, what I just vision as this pillar of the heart of the matter. So that's what was coming through, and I felt there to be value in opening to its expression being recorded. Oh my god, this is so fucking long. Okay. It's a really great article. It's a really great article. It is so long. I say that half laughing because I know my videos can be long, so I guess long is relative. This is reminding me of what I was talking about a couple videos ago with regard to familiarity, and within the context of a Supreme Court case, and just the legal field in general, I suppose, but how being familiar can be very limiting in creative authority. Right, that was it, yeah. How familiarity can be very limiting in the interpretation of whatever context is being interpreted. More spontaneous and interactive rather than predetermined, as each takes cues from the other. I mean, that's not necessarily to say that just because it's interactive and collective that it's not predetermined. Oof. Yeah, this article is now reminding me, okay, so yesterday And I had a feeling yesterday as I was watching these videos that this topic was going to be of import in the sort of immediate future. And those videos were in regard to copyright on YouTube. I was looking into the copyright policy of YouTube, and specifically in relation to reaction videos. And this spoke a little bit more to me because I was questioning whether the format by which I do research and contemplate by having the sort of dual screenshot of me and the screen recording, whether that would constitute a copyright issue, a potential copyright issue for content that I am referencing. I just had another thought. Hearing constitute, perhaps the extremes being the form, the shape, the structure is the constitution of that concept. I don't know, there's something about constitute that stuck out to me. Like, constitute, do these extremes, do these experiences of extremes constitute these concepts, these experiences conceptually from the more egoic sense of self? Is it constitutional in the framework perceived through the egoic sense of self? Aligning the egoic sense of self's constitution with the sort of multi-dimensional realities simultaneously occurring, including that all is just energy appearing to happen, in which neither I nor anything, including concepts, exists at all. And so I was going down this rabbit hole of copyright, and it ultimately brought me to, I believe he's a lawyer, but I ended up going down this rabbit hole of copyright and what the legal field, I suppose, considers legal, and what it considers an infringement on, I guess, copyright. And so this article is actually reminding me of that now, specifically with what she's saying. This is reminding me of how in copyright law, or the laws regarding the structures assessed in determining whether a copyright action is legal, or whether an action is legal in copyright jurisprudence or law. What am I saying? One of the factors, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, one of the factors for determining the legality of a copyright claim is whether the subsequent action, that which is being claimed to be an infringement, whether that action transforms the original material, or is transformative of the original material. In some way, there is a transformative nature, or it is done in a transformative nature. And so this is kind of reminding me of that transformational aspect of the copyright legalities. So maybe I will go back and check that out, because there was a case referenced, a United States Supreme Court case referenced in a video that I was watching about this particular subject, and so maybe we'll take a little look-see at that. But I feel like not a comparison, but I feel a similarity, a correlation. And the copyright, the information about the copyright claims also touched on originality. And that's something that has also come up in some of the videos from several weeks ago. The question of originality and the prioritization of originality. What even is originality? Does originality even exist? Yeah, I'm almost getting that, like, the zeros and ones, the binary systems, like polarities and dualities, and even paradoxes, how these extreme ends in the sort of structure that I was referencing before, how that containment is the boundaries within which is all possibility. But it's kind of weird to think about it as though all possibilities can simultaneously be experienced as that, experienced as bounded. Yeah. Okay, so this vision that's coming to me is a vision I haven't had in a while, but it actually may have been what sparked the whole process that eventually led to the vision board that I sort of began showing in the last video. But this vision that I have had on and off for it is like, I think it didn't begin, but the grounded analogy of it, or the grounded worldly mirroring of it was really began being highlighted through, oh gosh, vortex shedding. I think it was vortex shedding. And it was vortex shedding. Okay, it's sort of coming back to me. I had looked up vortex shedding because, well, no, I hadn't actually looked up vortex shedding on its own. That was prompted because I had been looking into, oh God, I had been looking into, I keep getting this visual of a video I had watched around that time of a bridge, and the bridge was wobbling back and forth and back and forth. I don't recall if that was a San Francisco bridge or some California bridge. I don't recall why that bridge came up. I guess I'm not recalling why vortex shedding was coming up at all. But vortex shedding. It's this this vision has to do with the this potential verbal sort of, I almost hesitate to say explanation, but I suppose maybe it feels more accurate just to say an analogy, a worldly analogy of a potential the potential emergence of conscious, it's not even just conscious, but the emergence of a particle, similar to quantum mechanics, a particle from like a superposition. But even in saying emergence from, that sounds so linear, successively linear, as though one has to exist and cause another. That's not what I'm intending to express. Asking this question is almost like asking, how can an AI answer his question on what's sentience if the AI itself is asentient? What is asentient? What is amoral? What is moral? What is sentient? Does it really matter? I mean, does it matter in terms of what you're using the AI for, I suppose? Or why you're relating, or how you're relating to the AI? How is the AI being relied on and depended on? Why are we asking this of the AI before we even ask this of ourselves? Again, this definition, this defining of, this isn't about morality really at all, but it's a good example of something else, because defining morality and defining amorality is fine. This isn't to say that there is something wrong and bad about defining these terms, these concepts, interpreting these concepts. I find it interesting how we're quick to put definitions on these concepts, on these experiences, and yet relating to these experiences in our lives on a daily, real-time basis, inquiring within ourselves how we are relating to them, how we are expressing them. What about that? How, according to these definitions, just taking this particular definition, not even asking how else this may be interpreted, how else morality and amorality may be interpreted, setting that aside for just a moment, using this particular definition, saying, okay, let's just assume, let's just say, for right now, in this particular moment, we are relating to this particular definition of moral thinking as blah, blah, blah. And then not necessarily projecting that onto onto external experiences, but inquiring within oneself, okay, how do I relate to this? How does this show up in my experience? And how doesn't it show up in my experience? Where may I be, aligning with this, and where may I not be aligning with this? How do I feel about that? How do I relate to morality within those shifts in expression? Does that shift how I perceive morality? Does that shift how I creatively relate to what it is to be or not be moral? I experience this quite a bit, actually. Could even say that now I am. Yeah, see, I also I I like what she's saying about ChatGPT providing a response and that sort of catalyzing, well, maybe not catalyzing, but sparking perhaps openness to unknowing. I wonder, and I appreciate how she practices in guiding others in this process. I wonder though how often at this juncture, if you will, I wonder how often the response to a ChatGPT answer, how often the response will be more of a sort of egoic response, but taking those feelings and in a way sort of compounding the egoic sense of knowingness, of knowing, to say that, well, I know better than this. I know that I am correct about this, and I have a better response. I have a better answer. And so I'm just kind of, that's coming through as a potential outcrop of frustration in how ChatGPT is limited. This is reminding me of that interpretation, reading between the lines, being open to interpreting everything from all lenses. Yeah, I mean, power of language and intelligence that is present in any human work, and that one can learn anything by relating it to something else. This reminds me of the type of I was gonna say intelligence, maybe the type of interpretation that is was it anagog? No, it wasn't anagogical. It was, excuse me, allegorical, right? Allegorical, metaphorical. Were they two separate? I remember, okay, it was literal, maybe it was literal, metaphorical, allegorical, and anagogical. And that's not to say that that is all encompassing and an exhaustive list. Yeah. Completely rejecting it or totally adopting it. Another another sort of building block, another infrastructural building block. Giving structure. Yeah, it feels like the paradoxes of life, the binary system of life, the binary perception of life, the binary reality of life. That reality gives structure within like it gives a dimensional structure to a reality of which it emerges from within. I get this vision of this like tunnel looking structure emerging from within, like you're looking down, like you're almost looking down a well. If you're up above a well and you're just looking down into it, it's this well that's continuing to emerge sort of toward you. And then all the paradoxes, their own wells. I love this. It can mirror back to us our most obvious answers, meaning AI. AI, generative AI, can mirror back to us our most obvious answers. And if we are challenged to read those answers differently, we might be pushed into a space of unknowing and thus the ground of richer thought. The other thing about this too is it mirrors back our most obvious answers, and it also leaves out a lot. And I've started to see this in how AI reads and summarizes the YouTube videos that I've posted, because I have been playing around with the summaries of those videos, and it's interesting to me what is put forward and what is left out. And what is left out tends to be the specifics, but the specifics almost feel more meaningful, perhaps because of the ubiquity of these generalizations that AI has a tendency of spitting out. So there's a lot missing, there's a lot sort of lost in the answers, in addition to the revelation of what is unknown, or I suppose it is part of what is unknown. Or perhaps it seems like maybe the unknowing here is a little bit more in reference to those creative, inspired thoughts that are original, that are beyond the sort of scope, beyond the kind of normalized, average, generalized information. So there's the unknowing of perhaps more creative information that goes beyond the initial response of a ChatGPT. And then there is also creative information, or just information that this kind of goes to what I was inquiring about. I don't recall exactly which video it is offhand, but where I was asking about the inherent meaning within information, whether there is inherent meaning within information, using sort of this example of numbers, and even this example of zeros and ones, and information just in general. And there's I don't recall the exact phrasing that was used in this article, in this essay, but the quantity of information available is astronomically unfathomable to human comprehension. So I guess it's not even really a shock that ChatGPT would be programmed to generalize and average, to calculate, but to filter through and provide its average deduction. Explicate? to give a detailed explanation of, to develop the implications of, analyze logically. Extremes, again. Yeah, I mean, I guess when you consider extremes in a linear fashion, that almost implies that they are mutually exclusive. But are they? Right. So she's saying, okay, so in order for me to conclude this piece successfully, I must explicate away your ignorance. In other words, I must explain everything in a way that you walk away with this fully understanding everything I've said. But if I do that, I cannot conclude this piece successfully because its premise is to not have you understand everything exactly the way, because the premise is not to explain everything in a way that you fully understand it and just sort of accept that as an answer, but that you inquire into your own unknowing about it. So it's to have faith that there is a ripeness, there is space, if you will, there is space of ripe unknowing in everything. No matter what is said, no matter what is expressed, there is always a ripe landscape of unknowing. Great article. Great article, Dana. Not okay with you, Altus? Oh my gosh. Okay. Yeah, this is kind of reminding me of what Dana was talking about in that essay regarding ChatGPT being able to quickly express the sort of binary arguments of a particular issue, if you will. And so when you bring in the premise of her essay into this expression about the rule of law, her premise, as I understand it, and I know part of her premise was to not to leave room for the possibility that emerges from from unknowing. So in saying its elements include having laws that are publicly issued and independently and impartially applied, I'm brought back to that notion of leaving room for the possibilities that emerge from unknowing. And oftentimes in legal proceedings are the application of legal precedent. And that is theoretically impartially applied in a particular context to maintain a sense of order, to maintain a sense of consistency that seems to be referenced to some degree here as foundational to a free and civil society. But I guess the question arises, is the leaving room for possibility emerging from within unknowing also foundational to a free and civil society? Perhaps within that unknowing is a more sort of, for lack of a better phrase, purer sense of freedom. that's where, in Dana's article, there was a lot of foundation in correlation with creativity as well. So there's creativity and there is freedom. There is that unbounded, there is that unlimited potentiality that is adaptable, that is flexible, and two, is foundational to the experience of living within society. And that doesn't necessarily mean that society needs these technical applications to maintain a sense of order. And I often feel like this is a fear that without precedent to rely on, without dependence on a very well-defined system, a really rigidly defined system, that without dependence on that, everything will turn to disorder, chaos, and that is inherently bad, and that is inherently wrong and unacceptable and to be feared. And I just really question often in myself, why is that perceived as so bad? Why is that perceived as so wrong? And that's not to say that disorder and chaos wouldn't occur, wouldn't appear to occur, wouldn't be experienced. And yet perhaps it is just that chaos and just that disorder in which the unknowing can speak in creative, free ways that perhaps the mental body isn't currently capable of comprehending. But perhaps is what a deeper aspect of us is desiring. This is bringing up the question she asked, and I'm trying to recall it. But it had to do with technical and adaptable application, and that there is a sort of discernment around where one is kind of like, to use the cliche phrase, don't fix what ain't broke. Sort of to say, in a more technical application, it's not always, the case in that immediate moment that something needs to be reassessed, essentially. Kind of along the lines of, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. But that doesn't necessarily mean to me that you can't still inquire into literally everything. I love this. This is actually, this expression around mapping is not all that dissimilar from a thought I had weeks ago, if not months ago at this point. Similar in terms of maps depicting the topography of myth, memory, and prayer, although the way it was coming through for me, it wasn't exactly in these terms, but embedded in the land. Returning a tool of power to a space of connection, yeah. And so the vision as I received it was similar in recognizing the different topographies, the different landscapes embedded within this sort of common space, but in a landscape of sort of spiritual, abstract infrastructure. And looking at that infrastructure looking at the landscape of that infrastructure, considering that landscape, the sort of spiritual infrastructure that underlies so much of how we perceive and relate to reality. Considering that infrastructural landscape embedded within the land, and underlying that rather than overlaying, sort of taking that landscape in a digital form. If there's a way to digitalize that landscape, I don't know how that would come to be. I don't know how that is visualized. I don't know how that could be created except perhaps somehow through digital twins, which is how I got, which is how I sort of started going down the path of digital twins. But using digital twins to overlay the current sort of physical landscape with this underlying spiritual infrastructural landscape, and how that underlying landscape could be a tool, just like they're saying here, could be a tool of empowerment in reshaping the perception and relationship to the land, to the structures on the land, to the institutions on the land that are born from these underlying infrastructural spaces.
We live in a world with many ways of knowing, with many different systems of knowledge. My name is Jim Enote, and I'm the director of the Ashweawan Museum here in Zuni, New Mexico. There's my field right there. It's disorienting. One time I showed my mother some aerial photos. Her first response was, I'm not a bird. She says, that's not how I look at things. She asked me, what am I looking at? I don't know what I'm looking at. Maps have done a lot to confuse things for people, and I think more lands have been lost to native peoples, probably through mapping, than through physical conflict. I had no idea at the beginning that so much story would come out of this map-making process. At first I thought we would create some new kinds of maps that counter and challenge the notion of what maps are, where north does not have to be at the top, that scale is unnecessary. What's more important is these stories of the history described in these vignettes of experience. We limit ourselves if we think of maps as only two-dimensional. This whole constellation of what makes up a map, to me, has always been far beyond a piece of paper. When people have a map that is part of affirming their identity, it tells them that they are of this place. I feel
the correlation that this has, this picture, this video right here, the correlation that this has to the vision I got within the last several hours, if that, the correlation with seeing from above a well as though it's coming up at me, and now seeing this, I just felt a well, pun intended, actually pun was not intended there. I feel this well of emotion, this welling up of emotion in that.
Feel part of something with this work. A lot of things that our grandparents tell us and pass down to us, as they always say, remember these things. Remember it. And too often things are forgotten, but I think the map art is going to be something where they'll say, you remembered.
I find the emotion arising in watching this quite interesting and beautiful. Right, now that we've had a banana and some pretzels. Pretzels that tasted a little strange. Oh shit, did I record it? No, I did not. I feel as though there's a little bit more in me today for this. Said that kind of weird. Alright, there's still some, we're still gonna keep going. Oh yeah, thanks. Thanks for the reminder, Thors. Thanks for the reminder. 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 Let's read this one first. Yes, I was. I looked up this part of the body months ago. Why did I look up that part of the body? Oh, I was looking up. Oh, okay, no. I was actually looking up more where this blue, whatever this is, this little blue, that's what I was looking up, not necessarily like right up here. Although I think in looking up this area, there were correlations or there were interesting notes about this area, but I don't at this moment recall what that was about. I love that. A taste for homeostasis. Homeostasis. Interesting. This is kind of putting it in a, this is kind of framing it in a way that's like reaching for a second piece of cake is automated. I mean, actually using that as an example, such as reaching for a second piece of cake, if it is accurate to say this is being framed in a way that is of an automated nature, that this is of an automated, within an automated nature, of an automated nature, that kind of relates back to what Dana was saying in how there is a stepping back from an automated behavior, an automated, I forget actually what terms she used, but I just remember the stepping back from, the default, I think, stepping back from the sort of automated default reaction or response into the unknowing. So it's interesting here, reaching for a second piece of cake as automated, as automatic. I think the brainstem, isn't that like the oldest part of the brain? I don't know. At least in like the brain, the brain's physical development. I mean, it seems like as long as an entity has been consuming is as long as it has, at least as long as it has invited a system that regulates how that consumption is digested. And whether the body rejects that which is consumed, and or whether the body accepts that which is consumed. I don't know how long the sense of taste has been expressing, has been experienced. I suppose a sense of taste would emerge from within an experience of a system that over time perhaps has learned to adapt in what is rejected and what is accepted, adapting to integrating that type of system and expressing that as through taste, expressing that as taste. It's interesting. That is a computational process, a series of operations that move the letter from one place to another until it reaches its final destination. I wonder too, can it also be said to be a constitutional process, where the series of operations could also be how the process in a more holistic picture, if you will, in the sense that looking at it as a series of operations from beginning to end, there is a series of operations that constitute the process, where it is maybe perhaps it would be more accurate to say a process. No, a constitutional process. This is how, thinking about it as a body, a container, if you will, the process being a container, a series of operations, that series of operations constitutes sending mail, constitutes mailing. Yeah. Well, I don't know specifically 1814, but this, I remember reading in the Metaphysical Club. I feel like if I remember correctly, this time period was very, I might be incorrect about this, but there's something about it to me that is really loudly asking, well, really loudly recalling the heavy influence of rationality and the heavy influence of rational deduction, cause and effect, really removing in thought the notion that nature cannot be controlled, that within nature, humankind can find all explanation, which again sort of goes back to Dana's essay about reopening the space to unknowing. And this time period, if I remember correctly, was predominantly focused on knowing and sort of taking the seeming miraculousness of life out of the equation and reducing nature to its parts that could be mechanically explained. So it's no wonder to me we ought to regard the present state of the universe as the effect of its antecedent state and as the cause of the state that is to follow. The reverse implication is that for someone without a vast enough intellect, processes such as a coin flip would appear random. Ooh. This is all assuming that mental intellect is all that there is to process information. So you have a complex function that puts out a bunch of sort of random information, and you can't distinguish whether that random, seemingly random, sort of random information is truly random. You can't efficiently distinguish whether that is truly random. And then to say that randomness is just computation that you can't predict, but you can't efficiently distinguish between the computational randomness and what may be truly random, but you're associating randomness with computation in totality. That seems a bit of a far jump. Actually, it seems like a bit of an easy, for lack of a better phrase, cop-out answer. There is an underlying complex structure that describes the language. Yeah, what he's describing here is essentially similar to what Dana was describing around ChatGPT's response to an input and the student's response to an input. The student's initial response was very similar to ChatGPT's initial response. Largely, perhaps, because of the way ChatGPT is trained to answer questions like that, or to answer, prompts. So in a way, the complexity functions train out of the system, the probability of randomness. So it's in a way they're training the system to lessen the chances of randomness, if I can use that terminology. Perhaps to lessen the appearance of randomness, to lessen the experience of randomness. It's as though randomness is trained, conditioned out of the system intentionally. So then it's interesting to say what he said above, that takes suitably complex functions and outputs pseudo-random. That can't be distinguished from truly random bits. In a way, though, it's as though the truly random bits are being removed from the system, so the complex functionality is somewhat akin more to predictability than it is pseudo-random. I'm not really getting where he came up with pseudo-random. I don't know. Perhaps I'm confusing myself, but it just seems like perhaps it's easier to capture the complex calculations when predictability is probable. But it's like you're calculating these complex functions based on what has already materialized in a measurable form. Randomness, in a sort of pure sense, is like the uncollapsed wave function in quantum mechanics that has a superposition, that hasn't materialized, that is pure potentiality. You're capturing what can be measured, what can be relatively predicted. So I guess in that sense, you're not really capturing randomness at all. Maybe I'm misreading this. I mean, I guess in a way he's not really, it doesn't seem to me like he is necessarily rejecting randomness, but like the sort of traditional material scientist advocating that it's only random and it's only non-measurable because we haven't done it yet. We haven't explained it yet in totality. We haven't deduced the mechanics of it. This is something else I was looking up not that long ago. Might have had something to do with my curiosity around telomeres. Wow, that's cool. Yeah, so this seems to be pointing towards, at least from very little I've gotten into it, that it's more looking at that which is greater than the sum of its parts, which has a degree of randomness. And what's ironic is that randomness showcases and expresses in apparent regularities, perhaps a cadence. So perhaps there doesn't need to necessarily be mutual exclusivity between randomness and the cadence. Like randomness doesn't necessarily have to mean that there is not a cadence of the emergence of that which appears randomly, if you will. I guess what I'm trying to say is random doesn't necessarily have to mean erratic in cadence. I mean, this reminds me of questions of the human psyche, and specifically violence, like murder. Questions around, well, when does a psychopathic murderer, when does a serial killer emerge? When certain experiences throughout their life are common throughout the population. Like, how is it that an experience of someone could relatively be considered quite common throughout a large population, and yet there are some who emerge, there are some through which there is this emergence of violent, sort of psychopathic tendencies. A similar thing could be said about the apparent success of a certain business, and where there is this question, there is this curiosity, why this particular business, why this particular person having certain experiences, when looking in the sort of background of those businesses or those people, there is nothing in particular that stands out that would perhaps put them into a position where one could look at it and say, wow, yeah, okay, I can totally grasp, I can totally comprehend how that emerged. The experience of emergence within oneself, it really is like a seed. There's some seed that perhaps there is awareness of at times, and it, in a way, feels, I don't know how to describe this. This is why it seems to me, you know, this quote, we haven't had the right tools. Not only the tools for analysis, but the tools for thinking. But emergence comes from within, or at least it is, the way that it feels in experiencing is from within, a birthing from within. And I'm not saying from, again, in like this linear, successive sense. It's a simultaneity. And in saying that, from within, we are the tools. We are the tools for analysis. We are the tools for thinking. So this constant reliance on looking outside of oneself for patterns of emergence that can then be measured and analyzed and mechanized and duplicated, etc., etc. I'm not saying that that is fruitless. However, it really, there's this invitation here to look within yourself. I would ask the author of this, have you ever experienced in your life what you would consider to be an emergence? How do you relate to emergence? How do you relate to the process, if you will, of emergence from your own personal experience, from within yourself? What has emerged from within yourself, and what has that process felt like? How have you related to it? What questions come up in that? I'm not saying that there is going to be an answer in the framework that that this modern culture tends to need. This is kind of like driving on a road. The software being like, desire to get from point A to point B. I'm going to go to the grocery store. So the inputs are putting myself together, getting in the car, driving from point A to point B. So the physics, so to speak, the physicality of the physical process of going to the grocery store won't follow the same exact process every single time. Perhaps I'll get myself together slower. Perhaps I will wash the dishes first. Perhaps I will take a different side road, and the trip will be 3 minutes longer. This is kind of interesting, and generally what is relied on as predictable sort of predicted, what is it? That's fine, but the interesting thing here is there really is still such an assumption that every causal state is determinable, is predictable. I mean, I guess it's kind of saying that even if we don't, again, to use that sort of like scientific, mechanicalistic perception of the world, that just because we don't have, just because we're not consciously aware of the exact mechanical, causal process that is occurring, doesn't mean that that negates the emergent theory that's being described here. But it's simply sort of just saying that this is a really sort of, it's basically just saying that emergence exists from a nested, it's kind of just saying emergence exists, but we don't yet know the exact specifics of all causal states. But even though we don't know consciously, even though we haven't computed all possible causal states doesn't mean that emergence is not occurring through a nested process of those causal states. Like, okay, I'm not really quite sure how vertically integrated is that different from nested. Interesting. Questions about the structure of the universe. Why, for example, life seems to exist only at scales intermediate between the atomic and the galactic. These sort of extremes, again. And this structure, life existing only at scales intermediate. Centered. Oh, that brings into question what is life? But in an emergent system, causation can operate at a higher level independently from lower level details. But is it independent if it's nested? Or does it just appear independent? The overall behavior of some complex systems is caused more at the higher than the lower levels. I mean, is it caused more at the higher levels? Is it observed more at the higher levels? Perhaps it's related to more at the higher levels? Or perhaps it's questioned more at the higher levels because, not questioned, but it's cause for pause. This is kind of also reminding me of Dana's essay and resiliency. Community in that last article was sort of referring to the reception and the rejection of what is consumed. Emergent systems are ones whose macro scale behavior has some taste, perhaps, has some sense of discernment, has some discernment at the micro scale. So emergent systems are ones whose macro scale behavior has some discernment at the micro scale. Interesting. Well, it's interesting because discernment, minimization that lies at the heart of good. So for many complex systems, there's a good chance you can find coarse-grained, macroscopic descriptions that minimize that noise. So this is making me think about, or what's coming through from this is the process of quieting the mind, if you will, of centering in a grounded sense of silence and peace within oneself, and how that process minimizes the noise sort of being the rather automated, conditioned, trained thoughts and behaviors that are inherited throughout life and embodied throughout life. And that noise and processing that noise, discerning through that noise to listen to what is speaking from a deeper place within oneself, a deeper place that can be framed as a higher source of oneself. I don't mean higher in a hierarchical sense. I just mean higher in an intelligence that is beyond mental comprehension and is it is sensed beyond the five senses. And so that noise at sort of a micro scale is the discernment of those voices, the discernment of those thoughts that are so conditioned, so trained, so recycled, and immunity to randomness. That randomness feels correlated with that higher source of oneself, that source of oneself that is infinite and eternal, that is so grand and vast and potential and full of potential, fecund with potentiality. And so immunity to that sort of discernment, well, not even discernment, I suppose, but immunity in a sense of filtering that randomness, kind of closing off that, that full potentiality, that can sort of, I can see how that can be sort of somewhat correlated with the noise. They're both sort of very constricting, they're very, very kind of confining. And so here where it's talking about, it's that minimization of immunity to randomness, minimization of noise, so to speak. That lies at the heart of a good notion of emergence. So both of those, that minimization pointing toward the maximization of openness. The maximization of openness in that silence, in that grounded sense of peace, that centered sense of peace, that from within that vast ocean of stillness is the landscape from which there is emergence of that potentiality. One could even say, I suppose, the potentiality manifesting, concretizing, but it's in a way that is it's like it's pinpointed. What's also coming through is that it's very narrowly tailored, which sounds sort of kind of paradoxical to what I was just saying about this vast ocean of openness. I'm just picturing like the lens of a camera, how it opens and then closes, and that's sort of like sort of cyclical opening and closing. So it's almost like the portal opens And yet in that alignment, in that centered sense of peace and stillness, simultaneously there is this vast ocean of potentiality, infinite potentiality, and yet in that centered, narrow focal point, not focal point necessarily as in, I guess narrow point as in collapsing the wave function. It's opening oneself to the full potentiality of what's possible and aligning with the collapse of a narrowly tailored experience, which plants as a seed that has nested within it all causal, what was the framework? Causality. I don't know. Yeah, I actually was thinking this, I was thinking about free will as I was just talking about something. I guess the sort of predictability, the determinant. I actually wonder, maybe free will is sort of synonymous with original seed cultivation. Excuse me. Yeah, I think I'm going to look, I'm not going to do it right this second, but I think I'm going to look at that Supreme Court case about copyright, because there's some interesting connections I'm noticing between the factors determining legality around copyright issues and what's sort of being talked about here to a certain degree. So I think I'm going to read that and see what we find there. Good morning. Salakadoola means a menchikaboolaroo, but the thingamabob that does the job is bibbidi bobbidi boo. Alright, so here is this case from 1993. What I found interesting about the description of this case, which was very brief, but how it connected to originality and fair use. And so I thought that was very interesting and kind of wanted to explore that a bit further. It's very possible that there have been further cases since 1993, perhaps even within the Supreme Court, that have touched on copyright. I am not sure at this moment. This is kind of an interesting way of putting it. That Two Live Crews version was a parody, which, quote, quickly degenerates into a play on words, substituting predictable lyrics with shocking ones. How bland and banal the Orbison song is. Which is interesting because that predictability with lyrics reminds me of the general sort of average coded output of, the ChatGPT, and that sort of default automated response to a prompt in the students that were talked about yesterday. And how that predictability in information, in the expression of information, and sort of this replacement, if you will, with shocking sort of being unpredictable, the transformative but creative perhaps, or it just appears creative, it feels creative because of the juxtaposition, and the bland and banal being the average, sort of generalized expression. It's just kind of interesting. So parody almost here kind of feeling a bit synonymous with creativity in and of itself. At least in this example, in what's being discussed here and how it's being discussed. I don't mean to say that parody, to generalize and say that all parody is synonymous with creativity, although perhaps perhaps a frequency of truth lives there. But that's the interesting thing too, parody almost in regard to originality and what emerges from that, whatever is being perceived as original or interpreted as original, parody sort of emerging from within that. Derivative works. Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh, Otis. Are you being a silly boy? I think you're being a silly boy. Ah. Whoa. Oh my gosh. A derivative work. A derivative work is defined as, quote, as one, quote, based upon one or more pre-existing works, such as a translation, musical arrangement, dramatization, fictionalization, motion picture version, sound recording, art reproduction, blah, 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 or any other form in which a work may be recast, transformed, or adapted. Isn't that just information in general? Any other form. Just simply information. Anyway. So a derivative work is defined as one based upon any form in which a work may be recast, transformed, or adapted. A work consisting of editorial revisions, annotations, elaborations, or other modifications which, as a whole, represent an original work of authorship is a derivative work. Copyright owners' rights exclude facts and ideas, and fair use. In no case does copyright protection for an original work of authorship extend to any idea, procedure, process, system, method of operation, concept, principle, or discovery. Yeah, well, seems like trademark. Yeah, interesting. As Justice Story explained, quote, "In truth, in literature, in science, and in art, there are and can be few, if any, things which in an abstract sense are strictly new and original throughout." I don't know, I find this kind of interesting. While in the vast majority of cases an injunctive remedy is justified because most infringements are simple piracy, such cases are worlds apart from many of those raising reasonable contentions of fair use, where there may be a strong public interest in the publication of the secondary work, and the copyright owner's interest may be adequately protected by an award of damages for whatever infringement is found. I find that quite interesting. Public injury. It asks, in other words, whether and to what extent the new work is transformative. Such works thus lie at the heart of the fair use doctrine's guarantee of breathing space within the confines of copyright. Interesting. The germ of parody lies in the definition of the Greek parodeia, quoted in Judge Nelson's Court of Appeals dissent as, quote, "a song sung alongside another." Modern dictionaries accordingly describe a parody as a literary or artistic work that imitates the characteristic style of an author or a work for comic effect or ridicule. It's interesting how a song sung alongside another down the line sort of resulted in imitates, or as imitates, is being translated as imitates. I don't really get that. It's interesting too because they're sort of looking at parody, they're defining it, or they're describing it as an imitation for comic effect. Imitated in such a way as to make them appear ridiculous. So there's a certain quality to the imitation that is considered to be a parody, that is paradoxical? Okay, anyway, so what's interesting about that to me is the comic effect, the ridicule, the appearing ridiculous, you know, the sort of painting another's work, or just the painting of another work as ridiculous, as in a light of ridicule, that doesn't necessarily mean that the parody, the newer work, isn't factual, if you will, in some sense. And I get that it's sort of a matter of how one sort of personally relates to that which is being ridiculed. If that's the experience, if that's the reality of someone's experience that they are expressing, and it sort of just so happens to have this comic effect, or it just so happens to be in a quality of comedy, that reality is to some degree factual to them, which brings into question this notion about facts. It's just how one relates to certain information and how that information is expressed through and within that reality, that experience, may be factual through the lens of the personal sort of association. So it has a claim to use the creation of its victim's imagination. Whoa. Okay, well, that was interesting.